Okay, so we have two wonderful people here with us today to help us get some ideas of how to get volunteers started in your community and work with HOAs and civic associations. Elizabeth Lardner is a graduate of the University of Oregon and Harvard University Graduate School of Design. She's a practicing landscape architect, urban designer, and planner, and a principal in a firm based in Alexandria, VA. By day, in her off hours, she serves as the park chair for Holland Hills Community and wrangles volunteers to enhance the community parks. The Civic Association of Holland Hills owns and manages 30 plus acres of parkland. Elizabeth has served on the Trees Virginia board and was co-founder of the Northern Virginia Urban Forestry Roundtable. And Steve Young is with us. Steve Young, AKA Ivy Man, I believe.
Among other monikers, yes.
He has served on as an Arlington County Park volunteer for over 20 years, is a certified master naturalist, and has received several awards for his volunteer work on invasive plant management, including Arlington's Bill Thomas Outstanding Park Volunteer Award. He and his family have lived in Glen Carl neighborhood for over 35 years, raising a grown son. Steve graduated from Columbia College in New York. He began federal service as a Navy and EPA contracting officer and worked for over 30 years at the EPA, where he focused on information policy, technology, and management, and received numerous awards. For almost 10 years, he co-chaired the U.S.-Mexican Board Environmental Program, Indicator Task Force. Currently, he does consulting for a local minority and women-owned business and continues volunteer work. So welcome to these two.
Elizabeth,
take
it away.
Thanks. So thanks for letting us have your ear for a half an hour today. What's exciting to share from the trenches experience with all of you, and I'll be curious to hear your reactions to this and your ideas. This is on rescue, how 2 NOVA neighborhoods have successfully engaged volunteers to get vines off of trees and shrubs. This is in my neighborhood, this image. I think there's only something second worse than ivy, and that's wisteria. So we refer to this as wisteria meadows. So it snuck in on an ivy show, but it's still equally horrific to get rid of. Next slide.
Okay, one moment. There we go.
And I want to thank Heidi for the introduction and just remind you that Steve and I are going to just walk through, our communities are pretty parallel. So we're going to walk through and give you some lessons learned and some ideas tried and tested. I think the biggest message from this is the picture on the right with the gentleman. He came out very angry when we were taking vines off trees because it turns out he was a bird watcher in an adjacent neighborhood. I explained what we were doing. The next time I was out walking the park, there he was with a lopper cutting off vines off trees. So never waste an introduction. Even if somebody starts by being grumpy, you can turn them around and make them an ivy slayer if you smile enough. Next slide.
Okay.
I think cajoling volunteers is really, really hard. I think there are a lot of reasons, particularly in a place like we all live in Northern Virginia. In our neighborhood, which was built in the 50s and 60s, there's a lot of legacy landscaping. So if people are not particularly attached to the plants, they like the maturity of the plants, and they don't understand what the initial idea of what the landscape was supposed to look like. And it's just run amok and run wild. I also think we have a very finite group of people who are willing to volunteer, and they get tapped over and over, whether it's for soccer parenting or PTA work or master naturalists. There are all sorts of places people expend their minimal time. Overextended families, having raised 2 kids in Alexandria and done the soccer drill, swim team, the whole bit. I was a better driver than a volunteer during periods of my life. It's just hard to find time to get families to get involved, but it's important to get them involved. The biggest obstruction we found in our neighborhood is I think and maybe 2 of us in our neighborhood that still do our own yard work. So folks who pay other people to do their yard work have a hard time understanding why then they should go into a commonly owned park and do yard work there. So it's a conundrum that and they also weren't skilled. They don't take care of their own yard. They don't have the tools or the knowledge on how to care for a common landscape. Another big one that I find also in my professional life is aesthetic differences. Our park policy calls for our parks to be kept in a natural way, but there are a lot of folks in our world who use Scott's turf as a definition of good parkland, mowed grass and a large canopy. You sort of think of the Central Park with no real understory, no shrub layer, no ground cover layer, just mowed turf and a high canopy. That's a very different aesthetic than a healthy natural landscape. And educating people to that is a challenge. We live, I think Steve and I both do, in neighborhoods that predate Virginia's legislation allowing for homeowner associations. So we don't have mandated rules in our neighborhood. We don't have mandated membership. That means we also don't have a mandated due payment. So our civic association is voluntary, and maybe 60, 70% in a good year join the civic association. And our annual dues this year are $140 a year. So for 30 acres of parks, 400 houses, that's not a lot of money. So those are the kinds of things we're up against in our Northern Virginia world. Steve, if you want to do the next slide, please.
Got it.
Okay, my lag is lagging.
Sorry, I assume I'm advancing when you, yeah.
Yeah, Kajol, you're on the opportunities.
Yeah.
Go for it. You get the good one.
Actually, Elizabeth was just addressing the aesthetic matter. So, you know, helping neighbors understand what healthy natural lands look like, that they do look kind of different from what they might have initially pictured as a nice, healthy natural area with the mowed grass and just a few trees. Really the habitat issues that you know, most biodiversity requires, that it might not necessarily look all neat and tidy, you know, if you are trying to provide healthy habitat. I know one of my issues is a lot of people think, well, this is terrible that there's all this dead wood on the ground. Why hasn't that been cleaned up? And we do get some people going into the park thinking they're being constructive by removing wood deadfall from the park. So there's so much need for more education, strengthening social ties between neighbors. Something that we've begun to do in Glen Carlin is sort of a Save the Trees campaign, where we're beginning to identify trees that are really under threat from usually English ivy here in the neighborhood, and actually trying to talk to the neighbors. We have some leaflets. This is a leaflet on the right that colleagues put together saying, hey, look, you know, ivy is bad. We'd be happy to help show you how to deal with it, you know, and work with you a little bit to get rid of your ivy. And we're getting a few, not a lot, but a few people are taking us up on that. And I did a removal for one gentleman last week, and I noticed that ivy seedlings were coming up in his yard. And I showed him where there was mature English ivy nearby. That was the seed source, because he didn't have ivy to that extent on his own property. And I encouraged him to talk to his neighbors, since he knows them, and maybe turn on his neighbors, you know, to get that ivy removed. I think one of the big issues is the landscaping contractors that, I'm sorry to say it, but most of them don't have a clue about invasives. And I have seen so many issues with unsupervised contractors, a lot of illegal dumping in the park, among other things, that they think they cut material, the park is right next door. Wow, what a great place to dump all this stuff. So we literally have more introductions coming into our park from dumping, usually by contractors, sometimes by landowners. And I want to mention on the lower left, this is a brochure that the Arlington Regional Master Naturalist put together on ivy. targeting ivy. So another educational resource with, of course, a picture of a broccoli tree prominently displayed. And we talked to people about broccoli trees and how bad that is. So I'm going to advance to the next slide and back to you, Elizabeth.
Super, thanks. So we want to walk through, as we said earlier, 2 examples of neighborhoods, one in Arlington and one in Alexandria. Holland Hills, if you're not familiar with it, is between Route 1 and the Potomac River, just south of Old Town. And it's a 70-year-old subdivision with about 450 single-family homes. It's listed on the National Register, and it has about 30 acres of civic association owned and managed parklands. Glen Carlin is similarly sized for households, but has about 100 acres of parks adjacent to it, and is in southwestern Arlington County. So it was interesting as Steve and I were putting this together to see just how many parallels there are between the 2 communities, and hope that some of the things we've learned will help you work in your neighborhood.
Even to the extent that initially Glen Carlin owned its park, but it ceded the park for briefly the state of Virginia. It was very briefly a Virginia state park, and then the state ceded it to Arlington County, and it became an Arlington County park. Yeah.
And that's an interesting side conversation. A lot of my neighbors thought maybe Fairfax County Park Authority would like to take over our 30 acres of parks, and thought Fairfax County might do better, but they didn't realize that Fairfax County has parkland immediately adjacent to our parks that look no different. So that's not always the bailout to go to the agency. This is what one of our parks look like, a Sylvan Glade of English ivy. It's just a mess, and is sort of what you're up against, privet. And when people bought their homes, they could buy a landscape plan for $100 from extraordinarily well-known landscape architects like Dan Kiley, who's internationally recognized. The plants of the 1950s, the parks are now a museum of invasive plants, all coming out of people's yards and filling in. Next slide.
And here in Glen Carlin, we do have a wetland, basically a stormwater management pond called Sparrow Pond nearby. That's part of Glen Carlin Park. And this is sort of work in progress that you're seeing on the far side of the water. All of those trees were festooned with ivy going back 10 plus years ago. This was kind of an intermediate stage where you don't see a whole lot of ivy, but you still see some more towards kind of the right side of the picture. Most of that is now gone. On the picture on the right, this is right in the neighborhood, and this is one of the trees that we targeted with our tree campaign. And unfortunately, a colleague of mine who's not quite as hardcore as I am did the initial treatment on the tree, and she didn't get every single vine. And as many of you probably know from your own experience, the ivy vines is like internet. They're kind of internetworked going up a tree when there's a lot of vines. And one single vine stem that hasn't been cut can continue to feed the whole complex. So in this case, she had cut quite a few of the vines, but there were still a couple of significant vines. And so you couldn't really tell that the tree had been treated at all, but education, education, education. And I'm advancing.
So Steve and I shared this background of our 2 neighborhoods to prove to you that it can be done. We had really, really awful situations, and we are making headway. So to shore up your courage to tackle this in your own neighborhood, it is achievable. We want to share 3 techniques with you that seem to have been effective in our neighborhoods in this onslaught against ivy. One is show and tell and teach. Again, many of our neighbors are extraordinarily well educated, extraordinarily sophisticated professionals, and extraordinarily unwilling to admit what they do not know. So you got to remember that people may not be able to read a map. They may not understand anything about plants, but they nothing worse than to admit they don't know something. So come up sideways, make it a game, somehow figure out how to disarm them and explain something, because education is really key. Also in our neighborhood, particularly during COVID, I noticed how important these organized work parties were, when nobody was going anywhere, no grocery store, no office, nothing, we didn't have a vaccine, people did feel comfortable coming out and taking ivy off of trees if they were 30 feet apart from each other, but they could see each other. So we actually had more people outside during COVID working in the parks than we had ever had before. So to me, that was a message that the ivy, getting rid of the ivy is really important, but the more important thing for a community is making it social and introducing people to each other. And then I think getting help, admit when you're over your head and pull in some contractor help or other expertise help to help put something together, because you can't carry it all by yourself. And I think, Steve, you had a story with this wonderful picture.
Yeah, this is a bit of a cheat in that this photo was taken at an amazing event on Theodore Roosevelt Island just before COVID started. Over 100 people turned out for the event that was focused on the brutal infestation of ivy on trees around the perimeter of Theodore Roosevelt Island. Really good publicity by people who were involved. So they got the word out, and we had so many people turn out, we divided into teams of 10. So my team was mostly Yorktown High School students. And this young woman was one of the students. I showed them ivy cutting techniques and they went to town, cutting ivy on the trees. I should have brought more folding hand saws that I brought, but we had a number that we shared a little bit. So she's holding a piece of ivy log, and her left hand, she's holding kind of a, looks like a wishbone of ivy vine that had all been cut off the tree behind her. And, you know, but it was really very encouraging to see how quickly the students, with a little bit of demonstration, picked up on it and just went to town. And there's a lot less visible ivy now around the east side of the island than there used to be. I noticed from Georgetown Harbor recently, there's still problems on the, well, I'll call it the north side of the island that you can see from Georgetown. So future task. And I'm going to advance back to Elizabeth.
Thanks. And for those of you unfamiliar with Holland Hills, neighbors in Holland Hills perceive themselves as a house in the woods. All the iconography, all the literature talks about the houses and glass boxes were nestled amongst the trees. That's all balderdash. It was put on a pasture. There were trees in the stream valleys that remain, but it does mean people really value trees. And again, the wonderful opportunity that each homeowner could purchase a landscape plan. This was not your typical subdivision, you get one tree with your landscape. This was a full-blown landscape plan with play areas, sand lots, drying areas, terraces, trellises, understory, canopy, the whole 9 yards. And people went together and planted all these plants. And when I was pulling ivy years later, an older gentleman stopped me and he said, "We put root tone on those ivy starts to try to cover the clay." So there was a real investment in that landscape, but now it's all overgrown and it's all in the parks. So the two images on the left are sort of how we portray our community, but the image on the right was a poster I made a number of years ago just as a teaching tool, and took it to work sessions because people didn't understand, you don't have to rip the ivy out of the canopy, you need to cut it, but then you need to pull it away. So just trying to graphically show how to do it and how to free the trees and get people to pass this along and do this on their free time, particularly if they didn't feel comfortable in a group. The next slide, again, is talking about the show with telling and teaching. There are lots of ways to get people engaged. We do community work parties that we rotate between all of our parks, so different people get involved if they live near a different park. I sign a lot of Sunday evening at 9:30 p.m. community service cards for middle schoolers or high schoolers who have to turn it in that Monday morning. So offering those credits, as a mom whose child still owes her credits, I get it, but it's a really good tool to get kids out and get them working and actually have them have a chance to work with other adults in the neighborhood. I found when you have a work party and you have more than your normal crew, it helps to be organized. And people, if they're going to give up their Saturday morning to come, they really want to have something tangible that they're doing. So periodically will employ such organized things as this list on the right that I printed as a poster, and we put, and then people could sort of check in and go to find a place to do some work and feel like they were accomplished something. If you notice, each of these points pretty much are removing vine from trees. So the task was the same, but it was at least giving people a sense that there was some order and structure, which really appealed to them and helped. Next slide is yours, Steve. Thanks.
And really, we largely just wanted to show more pictures of neighborhood volunteers at work. These are both taken in Glen Carlin Park, Long Branch Nature Center. One of my all-time favorite photos is the one on the left, reminding me of the painting, the famous painting, a little bit of the farm couple. But the name tags, we have found that can be helpful to have name tags available. Elizabeth is so much better organized than I am. I could tell, but I occasionally get organized, and we've done name tags so people can see each other's names. And
the name tags are important because it's back to that pride. People know you by your dog's name in our neighborhood and are too embarrassed to say, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name.
Yeah.
So it's just gracious way to have the name tag so people feel like, oh, you're Susie or something, or and can introduce themselves.
Also, I think taking photos is so valuable, and sometimes you don't appreciate the value until later when you realize that you have before and after sequences. And some places were so nightmarish, like Elizabeth showed, in the park. It's almost unreal to look at them now and realize how much we've accomplished over a period of time. You kind of forget what a mess things were, and it makes you feel good when you can look at those old photos and realize, wow, we've recovered this area. It's really much healthier than it was when we started. So photos are very valuable, and we're going to see more of it. But ivy piles, I like to get my volunteers to build a giant ivy pile. So there's one on the picture on the right, taller than the people behind them. And it becomes sort of a symbol that, okay, we got a lot accomplished. And I won't go into my diatribe about, I like to let it rot and decompose. Some people don't like these big piles lying around, but that's a side matter.
And before we move on to, we didn't have a picture of it, but in our neighborhood where people had cleared, because we're in a lot of RPA zones, so they were doing 2,500 square foot patches at a time. And it's important years later to take people back so they can see the ephemeral wildflowers that have come up, to remind people it's not just saving the trees, but once you remove that ground layer, and even there was no replanting, there was just like an unburdening, and the Mayapples carpet areas of the park that were once covered with ivy. So the pictorial representation, we should do a better job of using those as tools to explain people their time is worth the effort.
And it's amazing. It's amazing how resilient nature can be, and what a seed bank can still be present, years afterwards, of the original native plants, once you kind of free them from that overburden of the invasives. Yeah.
Okay, next image. Now we're switching from show and tell and teach to party. And I think partying, or making it social, is a more appropriate terminology, but making it a fun event for volunteers. It's sort of like basic organizing 101, but it's easy to forget. There's a reason why people always bring pizzas when you're doing volunteer work, or food or drink or something. Our parks are structured that, I don't know where the anachronistic term came from, park wardens, but that we have wardens in charge of each park. And celebrating the warden's work, with cookies and just a chance for people to speak, was really important. The photo down below is after pulling vines out of trees along a major road on the edge of our neighborhood. Krispy Kreme came, and people just really wanted to talk to each other and celebrate. And I just think we can't forget how important that is. I found, even with this large group in the lower left, once we taught people how to take the ivy off the trees, the subgroups continued to do that work during the week, particularly folks who were retired would meet up 1 or 2 people, and they knocked out the ivy in that whole corridor. So using your large groups, making it a party, teaching people, and then looking for spin-offs out of that has been a really successful tool in our parks.
And on to the next one, Elizabeth. Yep.
Yeah. The other thing I learned is there are only so many people that are willing to risk contact with poison ivy. So how can you get people engaged and then move them sort of ripple effect closer to pulling ivy? I put on our neighborhood listserv, is anybody willing to refinish some of the picnic tables and to paint some of the signs? And I got an entirely different group of folks saying they wanted to volunteer. And to me, you're cultivating volunteers. This is Ivy focused, but you never can have enough volunteers in your group. So you need to remember you have to bring people in under different umbrellas. Trash removal, if you have any kids in your neighborhood or scout groups, there is nothing better for a 10-year-old than to put their boots on and do a trash pickup in the stream. They'll be muddy, wet, but they'll be gloriously happy at the end. And then their parents will help you. We also, in that lower left picture, we had a real problem with our natural surface trails washing out. So one of our neighbors happens to be an Appalachian Trail crew leader. So that's why he gets the red hat. He brought all the picks or whatever they're called and the hats and made us wear them. And it was such a hoot to see all of these folks usually that wear suits and ties to be adorned in these hats, but we got the water bars put in really quickly. And that was another, again, a whole nother group of volunteers who are now on our list of volunteers for the park. So grow it any way that you can. Next slide.
And here we see more ivy piles and happy volunteers who actually kind of had a good time for the most part. So that symbolism, you know, as Elizabeth said, trying to make it fun. And I think we've all found that it can help to have a recurring event schedule so that people can kind of plan ahead. But also, once in a while, we have done things that are a bit more like a pop-up event, you know, sort of ad hoc. We suddenly put something together because several people were interested. So ideally, you're doing recurring scheduled events where it makes sense, but also maybe a little bit open to some opportunity arising. One of the things that we found has been here in Arlington with all of the companies that are headquartered here, a lot of the companies do volunteer days. And so I have not personally been lucky enough to get any of those, but a number of my colleagues have had, you know, teams of like 20 people from one of our companies show up on a day, you know, their volunteer day, and get a lot of work done in one of the parks. So that's another. And I would say targeting the schools, this is sort of work in progress for me, but I'm trying to begin to branch out to the high schools and the environmental teachers and other interested teachers in the schools to network in their students and steward their properties, which often are contiguous with actual public park properties anyway. Plus, the kids need service hours anyway. So that's another strategy that we're kind of developing, improvising.
And that's a really good segue to the next category of getting help.
And here it is.
The next slide, yeah, that's whether you're leaning on schools or businesses, there are also agency resources, state and local agencies that you can tap. I think it's also important when you start to tackle these to remember this is a daunting task. So break it into bite-sized pieces, take it step by step. You can't do it all in one day's work parties. You may take 5 years of work parties to make progress. And then I think ultimately you have to recognize there's some tasks volunteers just can't do. So be ready to hire contractors or bring in another group of folks who have more skills than maybe the folks do in your neighborhood.
And we've been fortunate over the years in Arlington. The county initially resisted, my opinion, really addressing invasive plant issues, but they got on board as citizens lobbied them, and they've supported bringing in a professional contractor. And I found that the combination of the work that the professional contractor is able to do, including the use of herbicides, which volunteers are not allowed to use in Arlington County. Combining what the contractor can do and what the volunteers can do has made a big difference. There's a bit of a story on this slide. That tree on the right, I had noticed lots of English ivy seedlings turning up in my own backyard. I was very upset about that. And I looked around and I saw that 2 houses down, the neighbor had a maple tree that was it was a broccoli tree. It was festooned with mature ivy. And that was probably the seed source for all these seedlings I was finding. So believe it or not, I'm kind of a shy person, but I gathered up my courage and knocked on her door because I didn't really know her. But I asked her if she'd mind if I cut the ivy on her tree. And she had no problem with that. She was very happy to say, oh yeah, that'd be great, go do it. So several months earlier, the tree on the right had been, lush English ivy. And it was very gratifying to me later in the late summer to be able to photograph all this dead ivy on the tree. But there also were wisteria vines that, I had not tackled. So you can still see some wisteria there. I agree with Elizabeth that wisteria could also be a bane. But now that house is turned over and that's all cleaned up. But I quit getting the ivy seedlings in my backyard once the ivy, it took several years, but the seed bank exhausted apparently. And advancing. There we go.
Great. So getting help. My best helper has been working with the Virginia Department of Forestry. For those of you who don't know Jim McGlone, our VDOF rep, I've known Jim for many years. So I twisted his arm and he said, sure, he would come write a neighborhood forest management plan for our 30 acres of park. The Department of Forestry will do this at no charge for communities. And it's wonderful. I professionally write these plans, but nobody's going to listen to me as the parks chair. But if I can bring in the Department of Forestry's document, it has a lot of credibility. So Jim wrote it. There also is Stream Valley assessment through Fairfax County, at least in where Howland Hills is in Fairfax County from the Department of Public Works. Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District has worked with our parks committees over the years on struggles to try to figure out what to do. We're mostly, of course, our parks are all the unbuildable lands. So they're all resource protection areas, they're floodplain areas, you can only do a little bit without violating all sorts of rules, and they're gnarly problems. So soil and water has been really a terrific resource, and I urge people to tap them. They also have good grant programs to help both communities and individuals tackle these issues. Next slide. And I just want to show you what Jim put together for our community. He did a 5-year plan in 2016. We have 7 parks that total the 30 acres. So he went park by park. Sutton Potter Park was the image I showed you before. And I have to tell you that Jim said, sell this. It is just, there's nothing redeeming in this park. Every layer from the ground to the tree canopy was invasive. It was an old pasture with an old farm pond that had all grown over. But it's a really nice buffer from Route 1 for our community. So I was not going to get traction selling it. So we looked at what we could do. Jim also put together, so he did a summary on the left with management concerns, primarily removing invasive plants. He put together a 5-year plan of action for the overall park system, 2016, 2017, 2018 to 2021. We've actually completed a lot of this. This was so useful in asking the community for financial and volunteer support. And you could prove that we had a game plan. People don't want to give you money from your dues if it's like a one-off. But when we could say we have this orchestrated plan to try to tackle these, people have been more than willing. And I grew the budget from about $12,000 or $15,000 a year to $35,000 a year. And that's based off of voluntary membership. Jim is going to come walk the parks with us at the end of this month. It's the first time he's ever been asked to do this, but he's going to reboot and write us a new 5-year plan. And I said, you need to really trumpet the successes to show that these plans really have value in neighborhoods. What we did, in addition to what Jim provided, is the matrix on the right, where we developed a matrix for each park and talked about what are the things that have to be done, what's the rotation on them being done. How could we're not scientists, we can't do extremely good due diligence, but we could certainly do some kind of casual citizen science monitoring to see what's working, what's not working, what's a fool's errand, where are we making progress. And I have to say, when I've met opposition in my neighborhood to what the Parks Committee has been doing, when I've handed them Jim's documents and these matrices, it's hard for them to come back and say, you don't deserve the funding or you don't know what you're doing. It's just a really good explanatory package to help people understand what the big picture is and what we're trying to do. Next slide. Now I've lost it on my lag.
Oh, this is the hire contractors slide with the zone along.
Yeah, so for those of you who know Glenda Booth with Dyke Marsh, she issued a challenge. This is Fort Hunt Road in the Mount Vernon district in Eastern Fairfax County. The entire corridor was vine filled. You drove down that and all you saw were mature trees covered with vines. And a significant chunk of that was Holland Hills frontage. So we did special work parties. Volunteers got really good at cutting the vines. You can see them dying in the center of the image. But what was left were the piles of ivy Steve talked about and the privet and all of the other shrub layer that were invasives. So we ended up coming in with a contractor who ground that all up. And a lot of it went back down as wood chips underneath the trees. And then we hired the mowing crew that mows some of our parks to just keep mowing to try to keep the vines from coming back up. Because the last thing you want to do with volunteer labor is have all their hard work disappear within a month. So you need to hold the progress and let people see it. So on to you, Steve. Thank you.
And I know I'm watching the clock here, but just very quickly, we definitely, I think, have all found that we can achieve success. And, you know, it's not all going to happen at once. There's sort of a triage stage. If you look at the picture on the upper right, when I first began working in this area, it was essentially functionally impenetrable. And it took a lot of work. This was a wisteria jungle heavily. Most of that is actually wisteria, which Elizabeth had mentioned earlier. But after sort of a triage stage, opening up access, we were able to begin to get volunteers in. And this little chunk of a tiny little creek, Salamander Creek, it's mostly cleaned up now. Most of the invasives are gone. Now, the downside is once the access was opened up, the deer moved in. It was so bad before, the deer weren't even going in there, but we now have more of a deer issue than we used to have. But again, that's a different story that I won't launch off into now, but it really can be done. And we've made amazing progress in Long Branch Nature Center over about a 20-year period, but it's kind of night and day between what it used to be like and what it's like now. And I especially love seeing the spring ephemeral wildflowers coming back. That's really satisfying to see how they've responded. So back to you, Elizabeth.
Okay, and here's my friend Jim saying, seriously, Elizabeth? And then the image of that same park that I showed you that was the Sylvan Glade of Ivy. We've just made tremendous progress, and it's fascinating now as people are rediscovering this park and we've opened it up. Teenagers got coerced by their neighbor to come in and cut vines. It's just been a real community effort. We've also hired professional invasive plant control companies to help us because some of it was just so horrific. We cut out probably 2 acres of bush honeysuckle and ground that up as wood chips. There was just every invasive known to Northern Virginia was there, but it's much better. So it can be done. And I think that's exciting.
Yes. So I have not been monitoring chat, except that I know that there's a bunch in chat. Heidi and Margaret, I don't know if you were maybe keeping an eye on chat, or I can start to look at it. And
there's just been a couple of questions that have pertained to the talk. So one of the ones was, what time and day of week has worked best to get volunteers? And then the other one was about the amount of roots being pulled over the area of Holland's Hills. So we'll start with the first one. What time and day of a week has worked best to get volunteers?
That's a really good question. My husband was the parks chair about 10 to 15 years ago when our kids were little. So Saturdays didn't work for us with kids. So he rotated and tried. We've tried Sunday afternoons, Saturday mornings, Sunday mornings. There are lots of different times. Interestingly enough, we've now returned to that Saturday 10 to noon slot pretty consistently, with some pop-ups if like we have a flood event and we have to do something an impromptu. But I think having the consistent time is helpful for people. I'll publish it in our neighborhood bulletin at the beginning of each season, and people will tell me they put it up on their refrigerator or whatever with the intent to come. So I think the consistent time is good. There is no good time for everybody.
The other observation I would make is time of year matters. I think it's harder in the winter to do early morning events because it's probably going to be significantly colder earlier in the morning. Whereas in the summer heat and humidity, it can be pretty brutal as you get into mid-afternoon. So for my monthly events, we do third Sunday of the month, 2 to 4 year round. But when you have the flexibility, kind of think about how the weather, the climate factors in and what's going to be more civilized for your volunteers. And it will vary. But if you're able to change it up, we have multiple monthly events in Arlington. You know, we're such a tiny place compared to Fairfax County, but there's opportunities for just about anybody. There's some even in the middle of the week. And so recognizing that we do have a fair number of retirees out there, that can work well for retirees who want to get out there and do stuff. The weekends obviously tend to be better for a lot of other folks.
And I think that's when we held our Saturday. Out of that, people spun out and did their own smaller work sessions during the week. And we tend to seasonally hold them like February, March, April, maybe into June, maybe one park a month. And then they stop for the summer because nobody wants to be out in the heat and they're gone. And we pick them up again, say September, October, November, sometimes into December. Just seasonally, it matters as well.
There's also and I will not claim to have a good feel for this, but the seasonality of when kids need service hours is something else. Like I was surprised the number of times that I had a lot of kids showing up in the heat of summer because they were coming up against a deadline to get their service hours. So even though it was horrifically hot and humid, I was getting turnouts of kids because they needed those hours. They were running out of time. So that's one more thing to just kind of be conscious of and potentially take advantage of. We do get some people who need community service hours in addition to the kids. And so that is another potential resource that you've got folks out there and agencies that you can potentially work with to connect to those folks. Yes.
I was just going to list the other questions. Sorry. Yeah. So there was a question that was, I think, centered on Holland Hills. Do you pull up roots over all of these big areas?
No, because that's ground disturbance. So that's the sticky wicket. In being in all those RPA areas, you legally can't disturb more than 2,500 square feet. We've had discussions even when Jim was putting the plan together, is that per park? If the Civic Association owns it, you know, what is that 2,500 square foot measurement from? If the park is multiple parcels, does that mean you can do multiple? So it's a little gray. But bottom line, if people are pulling up ivy, they're only pulling it away from the trunk about 6 inches, but they're not. There have been periods in Holland Hills where contractors were hired and flags were put up to designate a 2,500 square foot area. But you can only do one of those every year in that park. And those can easily get overgrown if you don't maintain them. So that's got to be a very tight choreography to really make any progress with your little squares abutting each other.
How did you address it?
this was prior to my time, but what they did is they literally strategically took surveyor flags and flagged each square and then built on that square. So you almost have to develop a grid where you have a bat infestation. And they did square 1, year 1, square 2, year 2, square 3, on like that. And then you could see the May-apples come behind it. So people began to see there was value in it, but it's a very slow way to do it. And you can, as I understood it in Fairfax, go through the natural resource folks and the invasive control folks and the park authority. You can file for a site permit and do it, but it's like $1,600 to do a site plan submission. So there is a way that you can now, if you work with Fairfax County, Aaron and folks have another path, which is also complicated, but you can perhaps tackle more area at one time if you agree to that. And there's a whole litany of things that you promise to do in return for that permission. We've not gone down that path.
So speaking of roots, I feel like there's still so much that we all can learn from each other and, other people who are active in the area. But I have a conjecture that I'm beginning to play with. Typically I have cut ivy. I've made one cut near ground level. And as Elizabeth showed in one of her slides, another cut several feet up and just removed that one section of ivy vine from the tree trunk. Well, that bottom cut was typically a neat saw cut. And, of course you would get resprouting since I'm not chemically treating those. It finally occurred to me, I realized unless it's an extraordinarily large vine, if you make the cut at the top and you cautiously use a pry bar type device to, as gently as possible, pry that upper part of the vine away from the trunk, using brute force, you can bend a vine down, and they're usually brittle. This is English ivy I'm talking about. They're brittle, and you can get an ugly, nasty break down near the base. And my conjecture is the nastier that base situation is, instead of a neat saw cut, if it's mangled, that may really set that vine back compared to what's going to happen with a neat cut at the base. So that's a conjecture right now, but I'm playing with that, and I'm cautiously optimistic that helps significantly set back the remaining rooted base of the vine. I also see some traffic about number of hours, and we started our monthly events as 3-hour events, and I realized, I was getting burned out after 3 hours for one thing, so I ratcheted it down to 2 hours. The high school group that I've been working with a little bit, they just do 1 hour increments. And, I quickly learned when you're dealing with, we didn't talk about scout groups, but Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts especially, and Brownies, the attention span of the younger kids is so short. I learned quickly, you just have to plan that you're not going to get much more than 20 to 30 minutes of productive effort out of them. And that can be useful, but, so think about your demographic and attention spans. And I agree that you don't want to burn out your volunteers for sure.
And if you do 2 hours with Krispy Kreme, 2 hours, making it social, my group, it's as much catching up on the local gossip as it is dealing with ivy. So 2 hours works because you need time to do both.
But yes, I have been known. I'm sorry, I don't do I'm terrible. I'm antisocial. I haven't done food or refreshments. I admire Elizabeth's technique.
It's my wardens, it's not me. Yeah,
I have done little mini history lectures, like Long Branch Nature Center has a history with the Robert Hansen, the Russian spy guy. We were a drop site where he actually left off documents for the Russians to pick up. And so I do often do a quick little history lesson about the whole Robert Hansen story and Long Branch Nature Center's drop site Lewis story. So and people find that entertaining generally. And we do a little bit of, let's look at the wood frogs, sort of nature commentary quite often. Plus, what's going on with the birds? Are we seeing any interesting insects? Teaching people about iNaturalist. The app is part of our activities, and that can help make it fun too. That, you know, oh, we're finding nature. Look, it's a cute little snake. It's harmless. It's not going to hurt you, you know, but you know, this is interesting. We found it because we were pulling stuff up. Other questions?
Somebody had asked about wisteria. I think we've kind of approached that. A lot of the other questions have been ones back and forth about different ways of doing things.
Oh,
we're directed towards our program. So we've tried to answer some of the questions as they've been popping up. So
I have a show and tell.
I see Mary McCutcheon as a show and tell.
And this show and tell and this one also will teach you a lot about the anatomy of the vine. And like what Steve said earlier, they feed off of each other. After they're dead, you can really see how intertwined they are. But not only that, they're beautiful.
It's the ivy internet that I was talking about. Yeah.
That's what I'm showing you here. And it's a thing of beauty. And tomorrow or one of these days, you have to wait really probably almost 3 years after you kill the ivy till you can actually harvest it like this. But it's worth the wait. So that's my show and tell.
Very cool.
We have a conflict. We have a lot of porcelain berry, and people don't know wild grape from porcelain berry. So also educating people on why it's okay to leave the wild grape. So we actually went in and had a professional invasive plant removal person helping us. So she tagged some of the grapevines and tagged some of the porcelain berries. So at the next work party, people could really tactily see the difference between the two. Because people were cutting vines. They were not discriminating between any vines. And so that's another educational curveball that you have to, that's graduate school for the vine people, but it's worth getting into.
Of course, the whole poison ivy issue, and I always try to do safety lectures for volunteers, and of course go over how do you recognize a poison ivy vine. And no, we don't want to cut the poison ivy vines. We just want to leave them alone, you know, but here's what they look like. And of course, when you have a tree with intertwined both poison ivy and English ivy, I typically encourage volunteers to let me or one of my most experienced colleagues take those on, because it, you know, obviously that's much more difficult to try to get all of the English ivy vines and, you know, minimally affect the poison ivy. I just think
we have enthusiastic volunteers who just dive into the poison ivy. So I thought we should have swag where we do our parks label on bottles of Technu and just hand that out at park parties, because people aren't familiar with the various lotions you can put on once you've been exposed. But I'm on the cusp of doing that, because some people's enthusiasm cannot be curbed.
Yeah, and of course, some people are fortunate that they're not really sensitive to poison ivy, and so that's great. But other people are sensitive, but they've never encountered it before, and they don't know. And right. I always worry about those. I know as we approach 6:30, I did just kind of want to say, there's so much that we can all learn from each other. Like, I feel like I've been sort of at this for 20 plus years, and I still feel like I'm constantly learning new things. And, you know, any one of us or people that we know might come up with a really great new technique that we want to share and, you know, get the word out, best practices, what works, what doesn't work. So I think it's great to just have more communication opportunities to kind of exchange like we're kind of doing here tonight, and just share our success stories, maybe occasionally an instructive failure that we learned something from. So, you know, that was sort of a semi-parting spiel.
Yeah, thank you, Heidi and Margaret. This is a terrific series of information that you're putting together. So
thank you. That was a terrific hour, really wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Steve, I just had a question for you, specifically regarding your ivy and your ivy removal. One thing I've noticed at my park in Springfield, where we do have some of those thicker English ivy vines, and I'm not able to keep up with it all, is that it does resprout, but I've had the joy of going back, and if I can get it in 6 to 12 month time period,
Yes,
that's when I can pull it back and it comes right out of the ground. I was just wondering if you've had a similar experience, or if I just happen to be pulling out the really weak ones.
well, I can't claim that I've noticed it particularly with English ivy. I have found early in my plant whacking, as I sometimes call it, I did learn that if I kept hitting the resprouts every several months, eventually the vine finally gave up and died without using chemicals. So I did learn that early on. Certainly in the case of multiflora rose, I found that when I cut the canes down near the base, and by the way, one of my go-to things is I use rose gauntlet gloves that allow you to reach into brambles, multiflora rose, other things, that they protect you pretty well. So that's just one pro tip. But the multiflora rose, after I cut the canes, like the next year, it was almost like the roots wanted to heave themselves out of the ground. It was like they shrank and lost their grip or something. And I found it was much easier to uproot the multiflora roots afterwards. So you might be noticing a similar kind of thing with your English ivy.
I think the roots really, because they don't, especially if you do it before the fall time period, when this is what happens with the autumn olives. I'm able to kill the autumn olives over time, but they just don't, in the fall time period, they just don't get the chance to refeed their roots. And then when they send their sprouts back up again in the spring, they really are weakened roots, and then the roots start to shrink. But that seems to be the key to killing autumn olive, which is really the hardest one I've come across besides porcelainberry. So, all right. Well, I was just curious about that, because I struggle with those English ivy vines.
all those dips in root tone 70 years ago.
It is just, well, I guess we should be happy that we've learned more about the virtues and values of native plants now. And so it's late in the game, but I think, it's kind of like one park at a time, we can seize it back from the invasives.
Yeah. Hopefully people will then extrapolate from there to their yards.
Yes.
Right. We're actually doing a big invasive campaign educationally in our neighborhood, trying to turn that wheel. Stay tuned. I don't know if it will work.
I have a quick question. You talked about the Virginia Department of Forestry doing, was he just doing the 5-year plan for your park? I mean, could we do a whole neighborhood?
I don't know. It would be worth asking him. I do not remember the details of the program. It's a program that they offer that I know that sometimes they charge people for it, but they do not charge community groups. So what constitutes that community group? I would contact Jim McGlone. I think he's still like in the Fairfax County buildings, right?
Yeah, but it's woodland.
Probably working from home now.
Woodland
right.
management, not neighborhood, not residential trees.
Yeah, you're right. Good point. So remember, it's a Department of Forestry. So.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you
for joining.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Steve. And great. So hope to see you all in a month. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for organizing. Thanks for listening, everyone. Stay safe.
Okay.
Enjoy spring.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.